There's a place in Arizona called the Petrified Forest National Park, 200,000 acres of protected federal land, rangers, interpretive signs, a visitor center with a gift shop. Tourists drive hours to walk through it and take photographs of what the signs describe as ancient logs, trees that fell approximately 225 million years ago, were buried by sediment, and over millions of years had their organic material replaced cell by cell with silica and mineral deposits until what was wood became stone. The Park Service is not hiding anything. The explanation is on every placard. The process is real, documented, and chemically understood. Permineralization. Silica replacing cellulose while preserving the cellular architecture. The result is a log that looks like wood, has the grain patterns of wood, and sometimes still shows the ring structure of wood, but is entirely composed of minerals. The tourists photograph the logs and move on. What almost none of them ask, what the interpretive signs do not address, what the geology papers treat as a closed question, is whether the process that produced those logs also produced something considerably larger. Whether the same chemistry that turned a fallen tree into colored stone could have, under different conditions of pressure and time, turned something of an entirely different scale into what we currently classify as ordinary rock. Not a mountain. Not a mesa. Not a volcanic plug. Rock. The kind you step over on a hiking trail. The kind that fills riverbeds. The kind that lines every road cut you have ever driven past without looking twice. This video is going to spend the next 15 minutes examining that question. Not answering it. Examining it. There is a difference, and the difference matters, because the honest answer is that nobody has done the work necessary to answer definitively in either direction. That absence and the missing investigation is as interesting as the question itself. Start with the chemistry because the chemistry is not disputed. Permineralization begins when an organism dies and is buried quickly enough that normal decomposition is slowed or interrupted. The organic material and wood, bone, shell become saturated with mineral-rich groundwater. Silica, calcium carbonate, iron oxides. These minerals precipitate into the cellular spaces of the original material. Over millions of years, the original organic molecules are gradually replaced. What remains is mineral. But the structure, the cellular geometry that organized the original organism, is preserved in stone. This is why petrified wood looks like wood. Not because it is wood, because it is a mineral cast of wood. The silica filled the same spaces the cellulose occupied. The grain is preserved because the grain was the architecture, and the mineral respected the architecture while replacing the material. The question this chemistry raises, if you push it, is about scale. Every chemistry textbook will tell you that permineralization does not discriminate by size. A microscopic marine organism can be permineralized. A tree trunk can be permineralized. The process is governed by burial conditions, groundwater chemistry, and time, not by the size of the organism. If that is true, and it is true, this is not contested, then the logical extension is that the size of the original organism places no theoretical upper limit on what can be permineralized. Nobody disputes this. What nobody has investigated seriously is whether the burial conditions were ever met for organisms significantly larger than the logs in the petrified forest. Here's where the speculation begins, and where it is important to be precise about what we know and what we do not. The claim circulating in certain corners of the internet, the one this video's title is designed to invoke, is that common rock formations, things we walk past without thinking, are permineralized biological material. Ordinary rock, gravel, canyon walls, road cuts. This is almost certainly not true in the form it is usually presented. Granite is granite, basalt is basalt. The mineralogy of common rock types is well understood, and the mechanisms by which they form account for their composition in ways that do not require an alternative explanation. But the claim is interesting not because it is probably right, but because the investigation that would definitively settle it has not been done. In 2016, a team of researchers at the University of Edinburgh published a paper examining microbial life in deep rock formations. Their central finding was that certain rock structures previously classified as purely abiotic, formed without biological involvement, contained chemical signatures consistent with biological processing. isotopic ratios in sulfur compounds that microorganisms produce and geological processes do not. The paper was peer-reviewed. Now, and it received almost no attention outside the specialty literature. The finding did not suggest that mountains are biological. It suggested something more modest and more interesting. That the line between biological and geological is less distinct in the rock record than current classification assumes. That organisms modify rock formation in ways that standard geological analysis does not routinely test for. Now ask the question one level up. If microbial activity leaves chemical signatures in rock that geologists did not routinely look for until recently, what other biological signatures might be present in formations that nobody has thought to test for? Not because the signatures are hidden, because the question has not been asked. The oxygen record is where this line of inquiry becomes difficult to ignore. The Carboniferous period, approximately 300 to 360 million years ago, had atmospheric oxygen concentrations of around 35%. Current oxygen sits at 21%. That difference is enough to change fire behavior, insect size, metabolic rates, and the scale of photosynthetic organisms required to produce that concentration. The standard explanation for the Carboniferous oxygen spike is coal swamp forests. Vast lowland forests of lycopsids, tree-like plants reaching heights of around 150 feet, produced oxygen faster than decomposition could recycle it, because the fungi capable of breaking down lignin had not yet fully evolved. The wood piled up. It became coal. The oxygen accumulated. This explanation is taught in every introductory geology course. It is the consensus account. What atmospheric modelers who work on deep-time climate have noted, in quietly and in footnotes rather than headlines, is that the numbers do not close cleanly. To produce a sustained 35% oxygen atmosphere with 150-foot lycopsids at the densities the fossil record supports requires photosynthetic rates that stretch the models. The models are adjusted. The explanation holds. But the adjustment is always in the direction of making the lycopsids work harder than analogous modern plants at comparable densities. This does not prove that something larger was generating the oxygen. It means the standard explanation requires the organisms it proposes to be working at the upper bound of their plausible capacity. That is a flag. The kind that, in other areas of science, prompts researchers to consider whether the model is straining against a missing variable. Nobody has published a serious proposal about what that variable might be. Consider two specific locations. The Chinle Formation in the American Southwest. This is the geological unit that contains most of the logs in Petrified Forest National Park. It extends across Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, and Colorado, approximately 225 million years old. The formation is a mix of mudstone, sandstone, and silicified wood that has become silica. At scales ranging from finger-width branches to logs several feet in diameter, the official account is correct. These are trees. They fell, they were buried, they mineralized. This is well supported by the fossil record. What is interesting is the chemistry of the surrounding mudstone. The Chinle mudstone is rich in silica, considerably richer than mudstone deposited by purely fluvial processes would be expected to be. The standard explanation is volcanic ash. The late Triassic was a period of significant volcanic activity, and airfall ash would have contributed dissolved silica to the groundwater. That explanation is probably correct. It is also chemically identical to what would be expected if significant biological silicification had contributed dissolved silica to the formation. The source of the excess silica cannot be determined from the chemistry alone. It would require biological markers, preserved organic compounds, isotopic signatures, that nobody has tested for in the surrounding mudstone. The obvious logs are where the investigation stopped, because the obvious logs are what the question was framed around. In the second location is the Columbia River Basalt Group in the Pacific Northwest, one of the largest flood basalt provinces on Earth. Approximately 170,000 square kilometers of stacked basalt flows, some reaching thicknesses of over a mile. The official explanation is a mantle plume, producing catastrophic eruptions between 17 and 6 million years ago. This explanation is well supported. What is interesting is what is found within the flows. Petrified wood. not at the surface, within the flows, between the flows. In the inner flow zones, there are fossil logs, preserved plant material, and in some locations, standing petrified stumps, still rooted in the ancient soil that existed between eruptions. The official interpretation is that the eruptions buried living forests. Almost certainly correct. But it also means that one of the largest geological features in North America contains permineralized biological material within its body. And the investigation of that material has focused almost entirely on identifying species and paleoclimate, rather than on quantifying how much biological material is present and what its contribution to the formation's chemistry might be. The mechanism is established. Biological material can be incorporated into major geological formations. The incorporation and preservation are not the anomaly. They are the documented fact. The anomaly, if there is one, would be in the scale, not the process. At this point, it is necessary to be direct about what this video is and is not doing. It is not arguing that rocks are biological. It is not arguing that mountains are ancient stumps. These claims, in their strongest form, require evidence that does not exist. What this video is arguing is something more limited, and in some ways, more interesting. The investigation of biological contributions to major geological formations has been conducted almost entirely within the framework of identifying fossil organisms. What species, what climate, what ecosystem, rather than asking how much biological material is present and what its contribution to the formation's chemistry might be. These are different questions. The second has been largely unasked. The reason it has been unasked is not conspiracy. It is the structure of scientific inquiry. You ask the questions your instruments and your frameworks prepare you to ask. The framework for studying the petrified forest was paleontology. What lived here? How did it live? And the framework for studying the Columbia River basalt was volcanology. How did this erupt? What does it tell us about mantle dynamics? Neither framework routinely asks how much of what we are looking at might have been biological before it was geological. That question sits between disciplines. It belongs to none of them fully. It has no established funding stream. It is not the kind of question that produces a clean publication. Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, toured cut-over land in Humboldt County in 1907 and described the remaining stumps as a field of truncated monuments. He was looking at the remnants of living organisms and reaching for the vocabulary of ruins, because the technical vocabulary did not exist for what he was seeing. That instinct, that the remnant of something living, at sufficient scale and sufficient age, begins to resemble geology rather than biology, is not scientifically naive. It is a description of what permineralization actually does. It turns biological structures into geological ones. Completely, chemically, at the cellular level. The petrified logs in the Chinle Formation are 225 million years old. They are recognizable as logs because their scale is within human perceptual range and because they were buried discretely enough to be found as discrete objects. If something considerably larger had permineralized at scales where the structure was not a discrete object but a distributed feature of a formation, there is no established investigative protocol for finding it. The question has not been asked in the form that would produce an answer. That is not proof that such material exists, and it is an observation about what has not been looked for. The tourists photograph the colored logs and continue to the gift shop. What permineralization tells us is that biology can become geology so completely that nothing about the resulting object announces its origin. You would need to look at the right level, with the right instruments, asking the right question, to know what you were looking at. The question this video cannot answer, because no one has, is whether we have been doing any of those three things. The logs are there. Obvious, named, protected. What might be there at other scales is not hidden. It is simply unlabeled. And the difference between hidden and unlabeled is the difference between a cover-up and a gap. The gap is quieter. It does not require intent. And it requires only that the people asking the questions have not yet thought to ask this one. The stone preserves the structure of what it replaced. What we call geology may contain, in ways we have not measured, a record of biology we have not looked for. That investigation has not started. It should.